The blizzard of 1884 didn't just freeze the cobblestones of London, it froze the very blood in my veins. I stood beneath the flickering amber glow of a single gas lamp, my worn leather boots sinking into the grey, icy slush. I was Peredur Mortham, a man the world chose not to see, a mere ghost in a city of stone. But then, the carriage door of the house of Drax swung open, and the world stopped. A young lady stepped out, draped in an emerald velvet cloak that defied the miserable winter. Her eyes held a spark of warmth I hadn't felt in a decade. They say a man's life can end in a heartbeat, but mine began the moment she looked toward my shadow. As she moved, a small, leather-bound prayer book slipped from her muff, landing silently in the snow at my feet. I reached for it, my frozen fingers inches from her silk hem, but before I could utter a word, her footman shoved me aside. The carriage door slammed like a guillotine. I retreated into the dark, opening the book with trembling hands. On the first page, beneath a pressed, yellowing lily, was the name that would become my obsession and my ruin, Amabel Verrall. Below it, in harsh, black ink, was the word that shattered my heart, betrothed. My breath hitched. She wasn't just a stranger, she was a lamb already marked for the altar, and I was the only one who saw the wolf coming. Driven by a desperate, illogical fire, I followed the scent of that pressed lily straight into the mouth of hell, the Diogenes Club. This was the sanctuary of the corrupt, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the stench of moral decay. Disguised in a borrowed waiter's waistcoat, I moved through the smoke-filled room, my eyes scanning the faces of the elite until they landed on him, Lord Valerius Drax. He sat with a group of sycophants, swirling amber brandy in a crystal glass. To Amabel, he toasted, his voice a jagged edge of cruelty. The prettiest bird I've ever bought. Her father is destitute, he'd sell her to a hangman for a bag of groats. She'll stay in the London gilded cage, keeping my parlour smelling of lilies, while my real birds sing for me in the secret cottage at Aylesbury. A man needs variety, doesn't he? The table erupted in laughter. My hand shook so violently I spilled a drop of crimson wine onto his pristine white sleeve. Valerius looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, the malice in him felt like a physical weight, a suffocating pressure. He didn't see a man, he saw a servant. But I saw a monster. I realized then that Amabel wasn't entering a marriage, she was being sold into a life of hidden shame and mockery. I stepped back, the wine stain on his cuff looking like a fresh wound. The following night, I committed my first act of defiance. One stolen key, one night of terrifying courage, and I was inside Valerius's private study. I wasn't looking for gold or jewels, I was looking for the price of a soul. By the flickering light of a single candle, I found it, a heavy, black-bound ledger hidden behind a false shelf of law books. My hand shook as I flipped through the pages. It wasn't a record of business, but of casualties. Names were scrawled in his aggressive hand, Mercy. Elspeth. Each name were dates and sums of money. These weren't mere flings, they were women he had discarded like used bandages once they became an inconvenience. My eyes widened as I found a receipt for a massive, hush-money payment to a midwife in Aylesbury, dated the very same day his engagement to Amabel was announced in the Times Star. He was paying to bury a scandal while he prepared to walk my emerald-cloaked angel down the aisle of St. Jude's. The ink felt wet on my soul, a stain I could never wash off. Just as I tucked the ledger into my coat, I heard the heavy thud of boots in the hallway. I realized then that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. I was no longer just a watcher, I was a thief of secrets. The Verrall estate was a crumbling monument to better days, its walls sweating with damp and debt. I knew I couldn't approach Amabel directly, a man of my station would be whipped before he reached the foyer. Instead, I sent a letter. No signature, no flowery prose, just a jagged warning, the cottage at Aylesbury holds your future. Look behind the locked door before you say, I do, I watched from the shrubbery as a maid delivered it to her by the fireplace. Amabel's face went pale as she read the words, her hand going to her throat. But before she could speak, her father, a man whose eyes were hollowed out by greed, snatched the paper from her. More nonsense from an anonymous admirer, Amabel, he sneered, his voice dripping with desperation. Into the fire it goes. You marry Lord Drax, or we sleep in the gutter by the month's end. He is our salvation." I watched, devastated, as the letter curled into black ash in the hearth. Amabel didn't cry. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of cold marble. She looked into the flames, and for a second I thought she looked toward the window, as if she could feel my eyes on her. The stakes were no longer just her happiness, they were her very survival in a world that saw her as a transaction. I couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. I found her 3 days later at the Covent Garden Flower Market, a place of temporary beauty amidst the London soot. She was surrounded by roses, but her face was more fragile than any petal. I moved through the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't look at me, Miss Verrall," I whispered, standing back to back with her as if inspecting the same stall. "Look at the roses." "But listen. Aylesbury is not a legend. It is a graveyard for women who believed Lord Valerius's lies." I felt her stumble, her arm brushing mine. "Who are you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of terror and hope. "Why do you haunt my steps?" I turned slightly, just enough for her to see the intensity in my gaze. "I am a man who would rather see you hate him for the truth than see you destroyed by a lie," I replied. "He has a child, Amabel. A child he hides while he prepares to take your hand." She gasped, her eyes searching mine for any sign of a joke. But she saw only the terrifying sincerity of a man with nothing to lose. "I am being watched," she whispered, her eyes darting to a black carriage at the edge of the market. "Then look closely at the man who claims to love you," I said, melting back into the crowd just as Valerius's footman approached. My interference did not go unnoticed. Valerius Drax didn't like ghosts, and he certainly didn't like servants who knew too much. He preferred corpses. That evening, as I navigated a narrow, fog-choked alleyway near the docks, the trap sprung. 3 men emerged from the mist, their faces obscured by caps, their hands gripping heavy lead pipes. There was no dialogue, only the sickening thud of metal against bone. I fought with the desperation of a man who had finally found something worth living for, but I was outmatched. A pipe caught me across the ribs, sending me spiraling into the frozen mud. I tasted copper and salt. They kicked me until my breath came in ragged stabs, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a scream. "Stay away from the bride, pauper," one of them growled, pressing a muddy boot into my neck. "The next time we won't leave you breathing." I waited until their footsteps faded before I forced myself to crawl toward a stack of crates. Spitting blood into the snow, I watched the red stain spread. "I'm already closer than you think," I wheezed to the empty air. The pain was a secondary concern, the real agony was the realization that Valerius was terrified. And if he was terrified, it meant I was winning. The beating had left me broken, but it had also given me a new clarity. I needed to get inside the Verrall manor, and I needed to do it legally. Using the last of my meager savings to buy a clean shirt and a high collar to hide my bruised neck, I applied for the position of a temporary wedding scribe. The Verralls were so overwhelmed by the impending nuptials that they barely looked at my face. I was hired on the spot. Suddenly, I was the invisible man in the corner of the parlor, my pen scratching across expensive vellum as I wrote invitations to my own heartbreak. I watched as the flowers arrived, as the silk was fitted, and as Valerius Drax walked through the halls as if he already owned the souls within them. Every time he passed my desk, I kept my head bowed, my heart thundering. I was writing the names of the elite, the very people who would witness her demise. But as I wrote, I wasn't just copying addresses, I was memorizing the layout of the house, the timing of the servants, and the cracks in the family's facade. I was a spy in the house of love, waiting for the one moment when the predator would leave his flank exposed. The manor was silent at midnight, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. I found her in the library, a room filled with the scent of old paper and unfulfilled dreams. She was huddled in a chair, a single candle casting long, dancing shadows against the bookshelves. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide. "The scribe," she whispered. "The man from the market." I closed the door softly behind me. "I feel the noose tightening, Mr. Clark," she said, her voice cracking. "My father speaks of nothing but the Drax fortune. Is there truly no escape? I walked toward her, the light of her candle reflecting in my eyes. Only if you are brave enough to walk through the fire, Amabel, I said, using her name for the first time. The air between us seemed to hum with a dangerous electricity. I wanted to take her hand, to tell her that I would carry her away from this rot, but I knew I was nothing but a man with a pen and a bruised ribcage. Our hands drifted toward each other over an open book, almost touching, a silent vow passing between us in the dark. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. We sprang apart, the moment shattered, but the connection remained, a tether of hope in a house of gloom. The following morning, the mask slipped. I was organizing the guest list in the main hall when Valerius entered, his spurs clicking sharply on the marble. He stopped at my desk, leaning over to inspect my work. I kept my eyes on the inkwell, but I could feel his gaze burning into the side of my head. I know those eyes, he said softly, a predatory silkiness in his tone. You're the waiter from the club. The one with the clumsy hands and the curious ears. I didn't look up, my hand continuing to move the pen. And you are the man with the hidden ledger, my lord, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. The silence that followed was deafening. Valerius leaned closer, the scent of expensive cologne and stale brandy overwhelming. You think you're a hero, don't you? A romantic lead in a penny dreadful. He straightened up, a slow, terrifying grin spreading across his face. In the real world, heroes end up in the Thames with stones in their pockets. He raised a hand, signaling his personal guards who were stationed by the door. Guards? This man has been found with silver in his coat. Arrest the thief. He hadn't just recognized me, he had anticipated me. The guards didn't take me to the constabulary, they threw me out into the rain-slicked street with a warning that my life was forfeit if I returned. But I wasn't done. I knew where the truth lived. I traveled to the outskirts of London, to a derelict shack in the marshes where the fog never lifted. There, I found her, Mercy. She was the woman whose name was first in the ledger. She looked twice her age, her eyes hollowed by grief and hunger. In her arms, she held a small, sickly child with the unmistakable pale blue eyes of a Drax. Valerius Drax, she spat when I mentioned his name. He didn't just break my heart, sir. He promised me a life, then let my child starve when I asked for a pittance to pay the rent. He told me if I ever showed my face in London, he'd have me committed to the asylum. I knelt in the dirt before her, offering her my hand. He won't do it again, Mercy. I promise you. If you give me the strength of your voice, I will give you the justice you deserve. She looked at me, seeing not a gentleman, but a man who understood what it meant to be discarded. I have nothing left to lose, she whispered. Take me to him. I was walking back toward the city when a private carriage intercepted me. The door opened, and Valerius Drax sat within, looking like a king in his velvet interior. He didn't look angry, he looked bored. He threw a heavy, clinking bag of gold coins at my feet. It burst open, spilling sovereigns into the mud. Every man has a price, Mortham, he said, leaning back. Also the world has taught me. Take the gold. Disappear to the Americas. Live a life of luxury. If you don't, I will ensure the girl suffers tenfold for your interference. I'll make her life a misery that death would be a mercy for. I looked at the gold, then at the man who thought he could buy the sun. Every instinct told me to take it and run, to save myself. But then I thought of Amabel's emerald cloak in the snow. I picked up the bag, feeling the weight of it. I looked Valerius straight in the eye, my face a mask of iron. You're right, my lord, I said. Every man has a price. But mine isn't for sale. It's for rent. He narrowed his eyes as I stepped back, clutching the gold. He thought he had bought my silence. He had no idea I was about to use his own money to fund his downfall. The night before the wedding, the sky opened up in a torrential downpour. I managed to slip back onto the estate grounds, finding Amabel in the stables where she had gone to seek a moment of peace away from her father's celebratory drinking. She was shivering, a wedding veil draped over a hay bale like a discarded shroud. They say you took his money, Peredur, she said, her voice small and broken. "They say you're a thief and a coward who sold his soul for a bag of gold." I stepped into the light of the stable lantern, my clothes soaked, the bag of coins visible in my hand. "I am a thief, Amabel," I said softly. "I've stolen a look at a world I don't belong in. I've stolen moments of your time I never earned. But I took this gold to buy a carriage for a witness. I took it to ensure that when I speak tomorrow, the world has no choice but to believe me." I reached out, my fingers trembling as I brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "I love you. That is my only crime, and it is the only thing I will never apologize for." She looked at me, and for the first time, the terror in her eyes was replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. But the shadows were always watching. As I turned to leave the stables, the butt of a rifle crashed into the back of my head. I woke up in the damp dark of a cellar, the scent of mildew and old iron filling my lungs. I tried to move, but my wrists were bound with coarse rope that bit into my skin. The sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding home echoed through the chamber. Valerius stood outside the bars of the small cell, a lantern in his hand casting a demonic glow on his features. "Enjoy the wedding bells, rat," he sneered, tossing my own warning letters onto the floor. "You'll hear them from here, knowing that while you rot, I am tasting the lips of the woman you ruined yourself for. You played a high-stakes game, Mortham, but you forgot that I own the board." He turned and walked away, his laughter echoing up the stone stairs. I slumped against the wall, the silence of the cell feeling like a tomb. The wedding was in 6 hours. I was trapped in a cage of my own making, while the woman I loved was being prepared for her execution. Adrenaline is the only fuel left when hope is gone. I spent 3 hours using the jagged edge of a loose stone to fray the ropes on my wrists until they snapped, the skin of my arms raw and bleeding. I looked around the cell, there was no door I could break, and the bars were solid. But this was an old manor, and old manors had old secrets. I noticed a small drainage pipe in the corner, the stones around it softened by decades of damp. I stripped off my shirt to muffle the sound and began to kick at the masonry with the strength of a man possessed. Stone by stone, the wall gave way. I squeezed through a gap that should have been impossible for a man of my size, the rough granite tearing at my shoulders and chest. I emerged into the sewers, covered in soot, grime, and my own blood. I crawled through the filth of London, the sun beginning to rise over the city. I was a broken, disgusting shadow of a man, but as I emerged from a manhole 3 blocks from St. Jude's, I saw the first carriage arrive. The countdown had reached 0. Inside the Verrall Manor, the atmosphere was one of funeral preparations rather than a celebration. Amabel stood before the long mirror, her mother and aunts fluttering around her like white moths. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk, but to Amabel, it felt like a shroud. Her skin was so pale it was almost translucent, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the room. "You look like a queen, darling," her mother whispered, oblivious to the hollow look in her daughter's eyes. Amabel touched the silk at her waist, her mind back in the stables, remembering the warmth of a man who had nothing but his word. "Where are you, Peredur?" She screamed internally. She had seen the guards dragging someone away in the night. She knew the gold was a lie, but she also knew the power of the man she was about to marry. As the veil was lowered over her face, the world became a blur of white lace. She wasn't a bride, she was a ghost being marched toward a golden altar. St. Jude's Cathedral loomed over the city like a stone giant. I reached the gates, but my heart sank. Valerius hadn't taken any chances. Armed men, his private security, stood at every entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of a ragged man. I tried to push through the side door, but a heavy hand slammed against my chest. "Invitation only, filth," the guard growled. I looked up at the massive structure. The windows were high, the stonework intricate and ancient. I saw the gargoyles staring down at me, mocking my helplessness. Then, I saw it, the scaffolding left by the stonemasons near the belfry. It was a suicide mission, a climb that required strength I no longer possessed. But as the organ began to moan from within the cathedral, a sound like a low, mournful beast, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the first wooden beam and began to climb. The wind whipped around the spires of the cathedral, threatening to tear me from the stone. My fingernails bled as I clawed at the freezing masonry, my muscles screaming in protest. Every inch was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. I looked down once, the carriages below looked like children's toys, and the pavement waited like a hard, grey mouth. One slip, and the story would end right there on the London street. I reached the high windows of the choir loft, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I used a small tool I had scavenged to pry open the leaded glass, slipping inside just as the choir began the processional hymn. I looked down from the shadows of the loft. Below me, the aisle was a river of white and black. Amabel was moving toward the altar, her father gripping her arm as if she might bolt at any second. Valerius stood at the front, looking triumphant, a wolf in a mourning coat. The ceremony was a blur of Latin and liturgy. I waited, my heart pounding so loudly I feared the choir would hear it. The moment arrived. The priest, a man of dignified years, stepped forward and addressed the gathered elite. If any man can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Valerius smirked, leaning in to take Amabel's hand. He thought he had won. He thought the shadows had swallowed me whole. I stood at the very edge of the loft, my figure framed by the light of the stained glass, looking like a vengeful spirit. I object. I roared, my voice booming through the vaulted ceiling like a thunderclap. The congregation gasped as one, hundreds of heads turning toward the heavens. I didn't just speak, I descended. I swung down from the loft using the velvet bell ropes, landing on the stone floor with a thud that echoed through the nave. I stepped forward into the center of the aisle, aware that with every step, I was burning the bridge back to my old life. I held up the black ledger, its pages fluttering in the drafty church. Lord Valerius Drax is a fraud. I shouted, my voice iron strong. He is already a father to 3, and a husband to none but his own cruelty. I hold here the records of his victims, the women he paid to disappear while he courted this innocent lady. The guards rushed forward, but the sheer audacity of the moment froze them for a split second. I was a man of the shadows, standing in the holiest light in London, and I would not retreat. Chaos erupted at the altar. Valerius's face turned a sickening shade of purple, his composure shattering like cheap glass. "Seize this madman," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "He is a thief escaped from Newgate. He is a liar seeking to ruin a noble house." He grabbed Amabel's arm, trying to force her toward the priest to finish the vows. The guards tackled me, pinning my arms behind my back, but I didn't struggle. Instead, I threw the ledger with all my remaining strength. It soared through the air, landing squarely in the lap of the bishop who was presiding over the ceremony. "Read it, Excellency," I cried out as a boot connected with my ribs. "Read the names of the abandoned. Read the truth." The bishop, a man of stern conscience, looked at the ledger, his eyes narrowing as he saw the Drax family crest on the inside cover. In the midst of the struggle, Amabel did something no one expected. She didn't faint. She didn't scream. She reached up and ripped the white lace veil from her head, tossing it onto the floor like a soiled rag. She stepped away from Valerius, her eyes fixed on me as I was pressed against the cold stone floor. "Let him speak," she commanded, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. She turned to the bishop. "Read it, Excellency. Tell us if this man is a liar, or if I am standing next to one." Valerius tried to grab her again, but she recoiled as if his touch were poison. The bishop began to read, his face growing paler with every line. The names of the women, the dates of the payments, the addresses of the hidden cottages, it was all there, recorded in Valerius's own unmistakable hand. Amabel's father, seeing his golden ticket slipping away, rushed forward in a blind rage. He didn't strike the bishop or Valerius, he struck me. His fist caught me across the jaw, sending a fresh spray of blood onto the white aisle runner. "You ruined us," he bellowed. "You brought shame to my house." I took the blow, and then another, standing back up each time with a grim determination. I didn't strike back. A gentleman of the heart does not use his fists against a desperate man. I just looked at Amabel, my eyes telling her everything my lips couldn't say in front of the crowd. The price of truth was being paid in my blood, and I would have paid it 1,000 times over. The congregation began to murmur, the scandal now undeniable, the prestige of the Drax name dissolving in the air like smoke. The final blow to Valerius's pride came not from me, but from the back of the church. The heavy oak doors swung open once more, and a woman entered. She wasn't dressed in silk or lace, she wore a tattered grey shawl and carried a child in her arms. It was Mercy. She walked down the aisle with the dignity of a queen, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She stopped at the altar, her eyes locking onto Valerius. "Do you recognize us, my lord?" she asked, her voice clear and haunting. "Or have you already forgotten the promises you made in the dark?" The child reached out a small hand, crying for a father who had never acknowledged him. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. The game was over. The wolf was cornered in his own den. When a man like Valerius Drax loses his world, he tries to take another with him. Seeing his reputation, his future, and his power evaporating, he reached into his waistcoat. The metallic asterisk click asterisk of a derringer being cocked sounded like a cannon in the quiet church. He aimed the small, deadly pistol directly at my heart. "I will have my due, one way or another," he hissed, his eyes wild with a frantic, cornered energy. "If I cannot have the lady, I will have your life." The crowd screamed, people diving for cover behind the pews. I didn't move. I stood my ground, staring down the barrel of the gun. I had already given everything, death was just the final payment. "Shoot then," I said softly. "But even in death, I have won. She is free of you." He never pulled the trigger. The police inspector, who had been alerted by the letters I had sent to Scotland Yard days prior, had been waiting in the shadows of the vestibule. He tackled Valerius from behind just as the hammer began to fall. The gun fired into the air, the bullet shattering a stained glass window high above. Valerius was wrestled to the ground, his fine morning coat torn, his cravat undone. He was dragged out of the cathedral in irons, screaming curses at me, at Amabel, and at the god he had mocked. The law is often slow, but today, it was just in time. The great Lord Drax was taken away not just for his moral failings, but for the financial fraud he had committed against the Verrall estate to fund his debauchery. The cathedral emptied quickly as the elite fled the scene of the greatest scandal in London's history. The once grand wedding was now a crime scene. Amabel's father was slumped in a front pew, his head in his hands, realizing that the Drax fortune was a mirage and his own reputation was dead. The house of Verrall was ruined. I stood in the center of the aisle, my body aching, my face a map of bruises. I was a hero to no one but the girl who stood 5 feet away from me. Wealth built on lies is just sand in a storm, and the storm had finally passed, leaving nothing but the wreckage of 2 families and the truth. An hour later, I stood outside by the gaslit colonnade where I had first seen her. The snow was falling again, gentle and white, covering the filth of the city. I was preparing to walk to the docks, to find a ship or a train that would take me far from the memories of this place. I had saved her, and that was enough. "Peredur," her voice called out through the cold air. I turned to see Amabel running toward me, her emerald cloak billowing. She stopped in front of me, her breath hitching. "You are free, Amabel," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I have no title to give you, and no fortune. I leave for the north tonight to find work in the mills. I only wanted you to know that you are no longer a bird in a cage." She didn't let me turn away. She caught my sleeve, her ruined silk glove pressing against my arm. "Do you think I care for the north? Or for coal dust?" she asked, her eyes searching mine with a fierce intensity. "I spent my life surrounded by men who looked like princes and acted like demons. I care for the man who stood in the light when everyone else stayed in the dark. I care for the man who bled for a woman who didn't even know his name." She looked at me, and in that moment, the social distance between us, the miles of class and money, simply vanished. "Where you go, I go," she whispered. "I would rather be a ghost with you than a queen with a monster." It was only much later, as we prepared to leave London, that she found the final truth. In the pocket of my discarded, blood-stained coat, she found a small, crumpled receipt. It was the record of a payment made to her mother 3 weeks prior. I had used the very gold Valerius had given me to bribe me, not for myself, but to quietly pay off the Verrall family's most immediate and dangerous debts. I had saved her family's dignity without ever intending to tell her, a final sacrifice made in the shadows. She looked at the paper, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I hadn't just saved her soul, I had protected her world while she was still trying to find her way to me. The final scene of our story didn't happen in a cathedral or a ballroom. It happened in a modest cottage on the edge of a Yorkshire moor where the air was clean and the fire burned bright. We sat together by the hearth, the shadows of the past finally retreating before the steady glow of the flames. The world would remember the scandal of Lord Drax, but we would remember the night the shadows died. I looked at Amabel, her face finally at peace, and realized that the greatest risk wasn't stepping forward, it was the thought of staying back. I would step forward 1,000 times more, Amabel, I whispered, kissing her hand, just to see you smile once in the light. We looked out at the horizon together, two souls who had survived the frost to find the sun.